Evening, everyone. My name is Neil Lane. I'm a longtime faculty member and fellow here at the Baker Institute. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you all to Rice University and the Baker Institute for what is our annual Civic Scientist lecture with today's distinguished civic scientist, Dr. Anita Jones, whom I'll introduce in a minute. This evening's lecture is part of the Baker Institute's Civic Scientist program, which highlights outstanding scientists and engineers who, in addition to making significant contributions in their fields of research, they also devote a considerable time to serving in government or in other ways serving the public's interest. Our goal is to encourage others to follow their example and more generally to promote a dialogue to help bridge the divide that many of us think still exists, especially in this country, between science and rational public policymaking. In fact, the word rational is hard to get out these days. The Civic Scientist program endeavors to spread the word about the vital link between science and the public good through both this lecture series and an outreach program we have, which last year sent a dozen scientists and engineers to local middle and high schools, reaching more than 1,000 students. This morning, Dr. Jones visited DeBakey High School, where she spoke to more than 100 students about her work and her career, inspiring our next generation of scientists. Prior to today's lecture, the Civic Scientist series has hosted 11 prominent speakers, including Rita Caldwell, former director of the NSF, Sylvia Earle, Subra Suresh, more recent director, David Baltimore, Alice Wong, whom I think you know, Jane Lubchenco, who is head of NOAA, Robert Curl, whom you all know, and Harry Croteau, Bruce Alberts, Shirley Ann Jackson, Arden Bement. I can't think of a better person to join this distinguished list than Anita Jones. But before introducing Dr. Jones, I want to thank those who made today's event possible through their generous sponsorship. The Civic Scientist program has received enthusiastic support from Rice, specifically from the Weiss School of Natural Science, Dean Ted Carson, and from the George R. Brown School of Engineering, led by Dean Ned Thomas. In addition, I'd like to thank the Ken Kennedy Institute at Rice for co-sponsoring today's event, and Shell Oil Company, as well as the Baker Institute Shell Distinguished Lecture Series. Today's speaker, Dr. Anita Jones, was born in Houston. She learned to fish in Galveston Bay. But she did not take up fishing as her trade. She is a distinguished computer scientist and has had a long career in research and public policy, starting at Rice, where she earned a BA degree in mathematics, then UT Austin for her MA in literature, and then she earned her PhD from Carnegie Mellon University in computer science. She stayed on the faculty there for some years and then moved on to the University of Virginia, where I think she has spent most of her academic career. She there currently holds the title University Professor Emerita. Her husband, Bill Wolf, who many of us also know, is a distinguished computer scientist at the University of Virginia and President Emeritus of the National Academy of Engineering. I had the pleasure of working alongside Anita in Washington when I was director of the National Science Foundation, and she was in the Pentagon, serving as the Defense Department's Director for Research and Engineering, which, as many of you may know, is position responsible for all defense science and technology, pretty much, including DARPA, the defense labs, and much else in the building and out of the building. In that capacity, she was also principal science technology advisor to the Secretary of Defense, that time Bill Perry. Anita Jones has a long list of honors and awards. I'll just pick two: the Defense Department's Award for Distinguished Public Service and Rice University's Distinguished Alumni Award. She's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, Council of Foreign Relations, the American Philosophical Society, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, AAAS, IEEE, and several other societies. She holds several honorary degrees, and the Navy has named a seamount for her in the Northern Pacific. If you want to visit, she can tell you where it is. Take your bathing suit. She has served on many policy boards, committees, and commissions, including the Defense Science Board, the MIT Corporation Executive Committee, and for some years as vice chair of the National Science Board. So I want to close my introduction by just telling you a story about how Anita bailed me out, as she did many others, I'm sure, when we were working together in the Clinton administration. The National Science Foundation, some of you may know, has always had the responsibility for maintaining the presence of the United States of America in the Antarctic. It does that by supporting science and all the logistic activities of 3 research stations, including the South Pole. We'd been using Navy crews and heavy lift cargo planes, so-called LC-130s, to get people and equipment to the ice and back. When Navy decided to get out of the heavy lift aircraft business, and we were left a little bit in the lurch. So I called Anita. She then assembled a room full of admirals and Air Force generals, more admirals and generals than I'd ever been together with in a room, and tactfully arranged that Air National Guard would take over where the Navy left off, and they have served the nation, of course, and science and technology in the Antarctic ever since. So U.S. is still in the Antarctic. Science couldn't be more exciting. Most recently, I guess, discoveries in astronomy with a telescope sitting at the South Pole. So it's an extraordinary contribution. It's just one of many, many war stories that we could tell you about. Anita Jones has distinguished herself not only in her field of computer science, but also as a civic scientist through her research, her public service. Anita, thank you for all you've done for science, engineering, technology, and for the country. We're delighted you could be with us today to discuss such an important topic, cybersecurity and civil society. So please welcome the Honorable Dr. Anita Jones.
Good evening. I'm very glad to be here and very honored to be counted among the lecturers that you have invited. As Neil said, I want to talk about cybersecurity and civil society, and in particular in the second half of the talk, I'll talk about maintaining civil society, who's going to do it in the face of attacks that actually could come. First of all, I'm a techie, I'm an engineer, so let me start with what do I mean by cybersecurity? Well, you characterize if something is secure in cyberspace, it's got a set of properties. And generically speaking, they are things like information that is supposed to be kept confidential is kept confidential. If someone is going to access it, you actually know who the accessor is and what you enforce these policies. Some more policies are integrity of information. The only accessor of information should be the owner of it or the persons that are permitted to either create it in the first place or change it along the way. And if those are the only people who do it, you say the information has integrity. It is what it's supposed to be because only the people who are supposed to change it have changed it. And we'd like non-repudiation, so if your kid brother signs an agreement with mother that he will clean up his room once a week every day in the year and signs it with a digital certificate, mom wants to make sure he can't repudiate that. And there are technical ways to sign things such that can't happen. So we define cybersecurity as a set of policies, and the question is whether you can enforce them or not. And I'll come back to policies later. I want to start with a bit of a case study to give you a flavor of cybersecurity in a specific context, and the context is voting. The process that underpins democracy is voting, and so if you're going to do it electronically, you really want it to work, because if it doesn't, then calls into question essentially all of democracy. The elections are controlled by the states, not by the feds. But back early in the last decade, Congress passed a vote called Help America Vote Act. And that legislation said was not what to do or how to do it, but that the states must create a plan for voting, and the feds would provide the money. States said, hey, we're cool, you provide the money, and they made a pell-mell rush to adopt and install electronic voting, because they were frustrated with managing all these paper ballots. They hate Chad, hanging and otherwise. And so they thought, the solution is electronics. All that software will handle it for us. So let me go back to illustrate my cybersecurity policies. So if confidentiality is one of the policies, in the context of voting, you want to make sure that a vote is not associated with an individual. Because if it were, then someone could coerce somebody else to vote the way they want them to, and then could check up on them. And so the software must assure that you can associate the vote with the individual. On the integrity policy side, you want to make sure that once a vote is cast, it's not changed. You want to make sure that the ballot that the voter sees on the touch screen is actually the full ballot, and some candidates don't get just dropped off. You want to make sure that every vote is actually counted in the tally. So you can take the generic cybersecurity policies that I talked about before, like confidentiality and integrity, and you can tailor them to the specific application, voting in this case. And they become much more meaningful and explicit at that point, and you say, yeah, that's what I want the system to do for me. And here are a few more. And you can see that they're broad. For example, the electronic system should not prohibit people who are blind from being able to vote. So you must take account of that if you're building the software for electronic counting. And it needs to be available so that voters can vote whenever they wish within the start and stop times of the polling process, whatever it is. Well, a whole lot of electronic voting products were built, and they were actually sold to the states. States had all this free money from the Fed, so they just went out on a shopping spree. And a number of computer scientists, and one of them is actually here at Rice, Dan Wallach, analyzed that software. And there's Dan up there. So, and they said it doesn't work. It's full of flaws. It can be exploited. And the voting process is not safe the way it is underpinned by the software products that that these companies are selling. We've got a bit of a problem. And the problem was not just one little bug or something like that. It is that the software had a number of flaws in it that could be exploited. The processes as defined by the state could be undermined, jacked around, and cheated upon. And the people who are staffing the voting polls, as you know, they only do this a couple times a year. They're not well trained. They're not experts in electronics. They're not experts in software. They're not computer scientists. And they kind of know what should happen, but they are not deeply trained in this. So there were problems from one end to the other. So what's the solution? Well, maybe some technologists would tell you it is, we'll just do a better job of a technical solution, encapsulate it all in the software, never touched by people, and we'll have a solution. But in fact, that just doesn't work. This is a people process, it's a citizen process, and you need a human-centered process that allows casual users not to make mistakes, not to do clicks that could be exploited from afar, use communications that can't be tapped, that can't be overwritten and changed as it goes along. And so one approach is what's called verified voting, and here I'm just giving you an example of what that people-centered process would look like. That yes, you use electronics, but in fact, in the voting booth, when the person is casting a ballot, the citizen is casting a ballot, you actually print the vote on a piece of paper and you show it to the person. And it's behind a screen, or behind a little glass panel, they can't see it, and they have to indicate somehow, push a button that says, yes, that's my vote. And then you cut off the piece of paper so the next person doesn't see it, but they've taken a physical action to say, yes, that's what I want. And then in the voting process, you accept the electronic results. But every once in a while, you go and you check the paper, you count the paper votes that you collected against what the electronic says. And if you ever find a disparity the paper is the solution and you throw away what the electronics are telling you. An old strategy, trust but verify. And provide in the voting process. The election bureaus did not like this initially. They hate paper, and this still has paper. But it has people look at what they did, not just look at the electronic screen. So this is an example of a solution that it's a public process governed by public policies, and it's got an underpinning with technology, but is not wholly a technology solution. And this is a solution to a particular cybersecurity problem. And now today, a majority of the states actually use verified voting. There might be other ways to do it, but this is one example for you of assuring cybersecurity in a practice that you know of. And it's people processes, not just a technical solution. So now back to a more technical view of the world of cybersecurity. You do have a lot of software, even hardware, in the systems that you use, that your friends and colleagues use. And the prevailing model of implementing cybersecurity is called perimeter defense. And you know that because of the very language that people talk to you about it. They talk about insiders on the inside of the perimeter and the outsiders, the people you want to keep out. They talk about gateways, walls, firewalls. DMZ stands for demilitarized zone, which is a catchphrase some people use. They talk about the intruder. That is the person who came across the perimeter. They talk about intrusion detection of that intruder coming across the perimeter. The majority of cybersecurity is phrased in terms of perimeter defense. Well, in the real world, it's never worked. Castle walls, moats, the Maginot Line, the Great Wall of China to keep the Mongol hordes out. None of them in the long run ever worked. And perimeter defense on computers does not work today, and you are quite well aware of it because you read daily about new bugs, you read daily about people having their identities stolen. One wrong click and something bad can happen to you. There are some things out there. There's some nice lights in the sky and some things that actually work now that are not perimeter defense. One of them is cryptography. Fabulous stuff, especially with the invention of public-private keys. The person sending some information encrypts it, and it can go through unsecured places, and the thing that's protecting it, anybody could look at that now encrypted message, and it goes to the receiver, and if the keys are handled right, only the receiver can decrypt it. Anybody along the way can pick up the encrypted message, but the protection of that is that the encryption is strong enough that it takes a lot of work, if you're using computers on it, a lot of compute time to break just that one message encoded with that key. And that's the protection, not some perimeter. What might be perimeter defense in systems in the future, in your body. You have an immune system, and it's not like your lungs or your liver and your heart. It's in one place, and it does all its work in that one place. Because my heart's over here. It is shot through the system, and when it detects what it thinks is something foreign, it attacks that in wherever it is in the body. And you can think about building systems like that in computers, in software, and we've done some prototyping, but in fact that's not a usual thing to find. But it's another idea. And so there are some things that we could do technically beyond what we do. So back to the current state. We develop software with the best tools we've got at hand. We field the software often with inadequate testing because the vendors want to get it out quickly, and then they patch and pray that it works. And the number with that strategy, And because software has just exploded, it's everywhere, it's doing all kinds of applications, it's very useful stuff, but the number of flaws that can be exploited get larger every year, and new ones are introduced. A few old ones get pulled out and fixed, but new ones are being introduced with essentially every release of software. So the current state, in summary, is we're using perimeter defense. That's the dominant approach. It mostly doesn't work. We know that from the real world. And of course, if the attacker is already inside, the perimeter doesn't work at all. So the average amount of money that somebody working in a bank on the inside can steal versus somebody from the outside is many thousands of times, and that's well documented. The security policies, well, as computer scientists, we can state them, and I gave you an example at the beginning generically and a more particular example for voting. For any particular application, you can make the policies specific to that application, which gives you a lot more to work with as someone trying to implement them. But unfortunately, software development methods are weak, and the millions and jillions of lines of code have all these flaws in them. And the hacker needs to just find one. The penetrator needs to find one flaw to exploit. And the defender has to protect against all. So this is a game that's set up for the attacker to win. Indeed, there was a Naval Research Lab study some time ago that studied specifications for the software, how it functionally should work, and half of the flaws were proper functioning based on the specification. So this stuff is really hard, and these are, of course, smart people doing these specifications and doing the implementation. So we kind of have a bad situation. And so I want to talk about that. One thing that compounds it is you and I live in what's mostly a software monoculture. We all use Windows. And so if Windows has a flaw, we're all vulnerable. I use a Mac. Mac didn't used to use Windows. Well, today it does. It uses Word. It uses the Microsoft Office suite, the same one you use on a IBM-compatible kind of computer. So much of the underpinning software, the general purpose software that we use, is all the same. So if there's a flaw in it, we're all vulnerable. If it were more diverse, we would be less vulnerable. So for example, in the news this last month has been a new vulnerability called the Heartbleed. It's not a virus, and it's not a bug. Well, it is a bug, and I'll tell you what it is quickly. I don't just want to tell you what it is. I'm an engineer, so I want to tell you what it is. There's something called the secure socket layer. That's what SSL stands for. You're all using that. That's part of your security software. And way down low, close to the hardware, doing very generic things, is a protocol where if two computers are talking to each other, they send heartbeat messages. And essentially, computer A, actually the secure software socket layer, who wants to know whether a computer that they want to talk to, whether that software is still functioning, they send a message and they say, if you're still there, repeat the code word Big Bird. And so if the system is there, it sends back a message and repeats Big Bird. And that's called a heartbeat message. And this is called the Heartbleed vulnerability because there's a little bit of a problem. When the heartbeat message is sent, there is a number that describes the size of the message. And you can arrange for that size of the message. So if the message is Big Bird, that's to be repeated back, that's the message. That only takes a few words. But if you can arrange for the secure socket layer to say 16,000 bytes, please, what it will do is, in this case, it didn't check that number to make sure it was just the number of words that would encode the message. And so it was asked for 16,000 bytes. That's not a large amount, but it would be Big Bird plus whatever followed it in the memory of, remember, this is the secure socket software. And so it's been giving out keys. It's been dealing with passwords. And some of that stuff is laying around. For efficiency's sake, it's not usually zeroed out once it's used. And so it would be sent back, and that's the vulnerability. So some random stuff that might be a password, so the receiver who's trying to penetrate the system paws through it and figures out what they've got. And since they know how the secure socket layer software works, they know what's in the buffer and what the format of things are. So here you are in the basic security software, and there's a problem, and it's been there a long time. And you can actually do a lot of damage with it. And it's technically called an overread because the requester who wants the message Big Bird to come back, Big Bird plus a whole bunch of other stuff comes because the buffer size was wrong and the receiver never checked it. So a view that I'm going to echo several times is that there really are technical problems here, and I believe the computer science community needs to provide the people that are going to give us cybersecurity with better architecture and tools. Now, Neil mentioned my husband, Bill Wolf. We've made a proposal. It would be a minimal mechanism that actually allows the user to define new protocols so that they would be diverse. You'd do something different than I would, and so that there is much more diversity. If you want to read about it, it's in Science magazine, and here is a pointer to it. And this is not an audience where I should get into such technical detail. I want to go more to policy things now. So, if what I say is we need some better tools and such, who needs it? What are they doing? Why do they need it? And what do they need to be able to do with it? Let's start with some basics. Who are the bad guys, and what are they trying to do? At a very high level, 4 of the main categories, and maybe you could think of some more, but this covers a lot of the waterfront. There are hackers, and what they want to do is they would just want to get in and do some damage because they can. They want to make a statement, whatever. Now, there are criminals. They're very different. They do not want to tear down the system. They don't want to break your system. They merely want to steal information that would allow them to get money. And in particular, they want to come back tomorrow and steal somebody else's software. And recently you may have read about them stealing thousands of records from the Target stores. Another category is terrorists. They're usually small groups of people they want to destroy. They have different motivations, some religious, but I would count among the terrorists a bad actor inside a company who gets disaffected with a company, is an insider, and wants to destroy something that will hurt that company. That's among the terrorists. But the most fearful of all are the nation states. They have a lot of money. They all have militaries, and those militaries are looking at cyberspace as someplace they have to play, and so they have developed attacks. Nation states have 2 interests. One is if they ever need to protect their country, they need to be able to do it in cyberspace as well as land, sea, air, and space. But also some nation states, not this one, by the way, we're of course developing attacks too, they want to do espionage for economic purposes and return that information to their companies so they can unfairly compete with other international companies. We shall not name them because we're not going to go into that anymore. But that's who they are, or some of who they are, and they want different things, and they have different modus operandi. Now, I mentioned before that you as a user are cognizant of all this and probably have some trepidations about where you go. This morning I tried to get on the hotel website and I couldn't even get to Google, and it said, will you accept this without their showing their certificates? And my operating system said, no reasonable organization would ask you to do this. So I didn't get mail this morning. I got spooked, and so I didn't even get on the net. You can't fix your own cybersecurity problems. that's a bit pesky because it's you who are seeing them, like what I saw this morning. It should bother you that you have to protect yourself. But not a lot of people are complaining about that. I'm complaining about that. But I think you should be complaining about that. In the real world, you do not spend a third of your waking energy worrying about protecting yourself from people who would hurt you. Because the society that we live in, you believe that there is a police force out there, and they are watching. And if something bad were to start to happen, they would come and help. And indeed, if they catch some bad people, they take them to the legal system and try to put them in jail, so that last time they got to your neighbor's house, but now they go to jail so they can't next time come to your house. And your money that you invest, you don't worry about the banks. The banks take good care of it. Maybe that's not so real, but it is real. It is, cash is real. Your investments, you may have them with a mutual fund company, and they protect them, and you don't worry much about them. And so here now you're in cyberspace, and you're worried about doing the next click because there's some message saying, you just won $10 million, or I'm a banker in Nigeria and I want to transfer $20 million into your account. And you are having to deal with this. And I think that's wrong. So I think the current setup we've got is not so good. Part of the problem, in a nutshell, is the internet, which has been marvelously resilient and expandable. There's a nasty secret. It is hollow. Everything is on the periphery. These red dots represent Rice University, IBM, and that big red dot is you. And you're on the periphery, and you can communicate to anybody else, but everybody is on periphery. And there's not a police department in the center. All that spam, when it comes to your perimeter, you have to sort it out. 80% of the messages are spam. And all of it goes to where it's sent because there's nothing in the middle taking it out. Now that's not really, well, it is security because it wastes resources. It steals your computing resources. But it's more benign than stealing your private information. And that is part of the problem. With the current system that we have, it is very difficult to hire other people, like your stockbroker and your mutual fund people and the police department and the fire department, and have them out there working on your behalf. It's that perimeter right at your computer that you're always using to protect you, and it just isn't good enough. So if you can't fix it, who are you going to call? Well, you got law enforcement, and they're thinking hard about it. That's the FBI, that's Homeland Security, that's the Houston Police Force. You could call the military. That's who we call in extremis. In a terrible natural disaster, when everything else is thrown in and it's not enough, you call the military. And of course, they're protecting you on foreign shores. The intelligence agencies, maybe you don't think about them protecting you, but there are a number of incidents that would have happened except they foiled them. So they are out there protecting you, and the legal system protects you. So here's some of the people you could call. So what do they need? Well, first of all, what are they saying? Well, here's a couple of things. You can just read them. You can have the National Security Agency director saying, we need a government strategy to protect critical infrastructure, but by the way, it's all in private hands. And you say, whoa, do I want the government doing that? And then you have the CIA director coming along immediately after and saying, I'm sorry, the nation can't protect the civilian infrastructure. It has trouble protecting some of the government infrastructure. And the FBI director saying, computer attacks pose the biggest risk other than a weapon of mass destruction in a major U.S. city. And by the way, we'll retaliate, the president says. Reiterated again by the Secretary of Defense. Since I'm here in Houston, I will echo that old phrase from the space folks. Houston, we have a problem. You have government agencies who are charged to do something, and they're trying to aggressively, this is a new problem, relatively new problem. It's only 3 decades old, maybe. But it wasn't bad in initial days, and I'll come to that later. They're aggressively sorting out what are they supposed to do and how are they going to do it. So I come back to what tools do they have at their disposal? Well, they've got the same internet you do. One of the charms of the internet is same everywhere. That's why it works everywhere. And they are running the same software you do. Your Department of Defense runs Windows all over the place, and the majority of its military communications go across civil telecommunications lines. Yes, there are some secure networks which are not connected to the internet. And yes, there are some networks that are actually fiber. When you're talking about the National Military Command Authority, where the president has to talk to the SAC commander about nuclear strikes and such, there is fiber. There's no civil telecommunications involved. But that's for very few number of messages. For normal operations, the military I'm talking about now, because that's what I know the most about. So Houston, they have a problem. They're using the same software development processes. They're in the same monoculture. They run Windows too. They use the same telecommunications. They don't have a different route so they can just unplug the internet and not use it. They do have something you don't have, and that is they've spent a fair amount of money on attack tools, so they know how to do some things. But by the way, they don't want to show their cards to anybody else, and so they don't use them because the other side would then know. Another huge problem is that they cannot attribute an attack to the attacker. Those messages that are coming in could have come from anywhere. One nation could cause a set of attacks to come in that look like they're coming from a different, remember, everybody's at the end. And so bad nation A could penetrate half the computers belonging to the military of nation B and launch an attack on some third country, and it would look like nation B is doing that. And so it is very difficult to attribute, i.e. identify 100% sure of who is doing an attack. Now, if you put a lot of assets in the net and you watch the traffic, you can make some pretty good guesses, but it is circumstantial evidence. Are you going to launch missiles on the basis of that? That's a terrible place to put a precedent. Back to the military, up until several years ago, they had 4 operational domains: land, sea, air, and space. They've added cyber. And they are enlarging the cyber command rapidly as we speak. But they have a problem. Remember, they're operating, for the most part, in the same environment you are. So they have the same perimeter defense. We all use cryptography, and that helps some. But one of the strengths of the U.S. military is they train, and then they train, and then they train. One reason they are so good, and they are so good, is that they train. But they don't train fulsomely with cyber. The first reason they don't do it is if you take Dan Wallach and Richard Tapia, maybe a couple of other people, and say, we're going to run a 10,000 soldier exercise, and by the way, you be the red cell and try to attack our cyber systems. I wouldn't be surprised if they couldn't shut them down. There are just so many flaws out there. And again, the penetrator only has to penetrate one. And so the military tends not to train with sort of a full red team cyber attack going on in the same way. What you want to happen is that they train that way. Yes, the attackers make some inroads, there's some degradation of operations, but they continue to operate. And that's what we pay the military to do, that's what we trust them to do, and in the military regime, it's very hard. Second reason they don't exercise fulsomely is they don't launch attacks. because they don't want those in the wild, as we say. They don't want those observable by anybody else. And nation states who might become adversaries watch those training. They have sensors out there sensing what's in cyberspace when those happen. Another thing that's peculiar is up until this year, the government hasn't exchanged cyber safety information. Back in the nuclear times, when you had the Soviets and the U.S. Nose to nose in the Cold War, both rattling nuclear weapons, nuclear scientists went back and forth a lot, but what they exchanged was safety information. It was in the U.S. interest that the Soviets knew everything we knew about keeping those weapons safe, because we wanted them to use that. We wanted it to take 3 people to actually cause a launch. And that there's not been a counterpart, though this, just in a few months ago, Obama sent some people over, at least to China, maybe actually to Russia as well, to talk about cyber safety information. And this is a good thing. I already talked about attribution, but that is part of the problem. If you're going to order the military, the civilian leadership orders the military to attack somebody, you really want to know it's the bad people who have been doing harm that you're attacking. And without attribution, 100% attribution, it's a very dicey situation. So my analogy I want you to walk away realizing today is that the virtual world doesn't offer the same basis to build civilian protection or to build protection in the cyber world as it does in the real world. I mean, do you expect the Houston police force to keep the mafia from stealing your private information and getting into your bank account? I doubt if you do, because that's not something that you would expect them to do. Again, this is a new problem. But just like you're expected to protect yourself and not make a wrong click or run software that you shouldn't run, they're in the same situation, and they need help. They need particularly technical help. Anecdotally, it's not said a lot, but anecdotally in the military community, another problem is that once you start launching cyber attacks, trying to degrade, let's say you have 2 groups there in a training exercise, and one is trying to degrade it's actually the whole electromagnetic spectrum, so you jam their radios and such like that. You try to degrade their operations. Once cyber really comes into play, there are not many graduated responses. You know, you shoot a gun and it just gets shot within 1,000 yards of the muzzle. You launch a single little virus and it can go across the entire internet. So it's very difficult to deliver graduated responses that deal with the situation. Now that really hamstrings the policymakers who would like to say, well, you know, we're going to ratchet up and be more belligerent about this, but, you know, we don't really want to go to war at this point. But they don't have so many options. Recall my main message here. And what would you need in those technical tools? You really need attribution. And that's going to mean some kind of very slight but changes to, I think, to the internet, certainly to some hardware where messages emanate. Today, you lose a virus, you can't predict what's going to happen to it, where it's going to go, because it could essentially go anywhere. Now, there's some limitations, but by and large, it's not something you can carefully control like you can. If I shoot a bow and arrow over that way, the arrow's only going to go over that way. It's not going to stick in that chair over here. Anyway, so these are the kind of things that I think we need. And the problem is that the cybersecurity problem got worse in the last decade. The first virus was like in the 60s. When was Morris, the Morris worm? In the 60s or 70s? 88. Whoa, okay, 88 he says. at that point, you were worried about the information. So what people would do in response to the first ones they saw is they just unplugged from the network that they were on. It wasn't the internet at the time. But, and in times of old, the attacks were on information. And you say, well, that's okay, but I can still eat, I can still keep warm, I can still keep the lights on. However, today our society is shot through with applications where computers are connected to devices and things and systems. And you can now attack what is connected to the network. And you can launch attacks that damage infrastructure. I was talking to the ambassador today, and he said he wanted the Baker Policy School to look particularly at cybersecurity in the energy grid. The poster child virus for attacking infrastructure things is a virus called Stuxnet. It roamed the internet, went a lot of places. It was looking for some control systems that were specific to controlling a particular kind of device, centrifuges in Iran. Those particular controllers were made by Siemens, and they had a particular signature. And so this virus, it would wander around, it would say, are you what I'm looking for? No, 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 and almost nothing was what it was looking for, but then it found some. And then once it found it recognized software and maybe some signatures of hardware. And it recognized those, and it said, that's what I'm looking for. And then it launched the payload, which is spin up this centrifuge to process as fast as it can, then slam it down, and do that again. And you do that to transformers, centrifuges, and pretty soon they break. And so now cyber attacks can actually attack physical things and physical things that matter. Technology can and does and has changed how society operates, and so we are now more vulnerable than we were even 10 years ago. And again, we need those tools. You can't protect yourself, and you can't push the problem, because of the way the cyber world is, you can't push the problem out far enough to hire someone else to do it. And I read this week that 18% of adults who are online reported personal information stolen. And there's no counterpart to that in the real world. You are not threatened to that degree in the real world. And this is a problem that we need to fix. Thank you.
Happy to take questions, please. With a question mark, I mean those kind of questions. I'll let you pick.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Wasim. I'm a computer science senior here at Rice. And my question to you is, I see a lot of focus on building software and making things, and now society's like moving towards the Internet of Things, as you mentioned. Do you think there's a deficiency in the focus on cybersecurity, and perhaps could our education in computer science be changed to improve that?
I think we're, by the way, great choice of me. Let's see, I think we're teaching the best that's known, and there are a lot of people like Dan who are working on coming up with these new architectures, these new tools, these new solutions. And I think it is not an education problem. I think our development of software has run way ahead of what we can control. We just don't have, do you prove your program's correct? I don't think so. I bet you don't even get close. It's to a large degree software tools, and we are just out in front of our headlights. Now, I'm an optimist. I think those things are out there, but I think we have to be willing to change the structures that we have today to incorporate them. And computer scientists like you need to first find them, and then we can teach them. Someone here. Never mind. Go ahead.
I was wondering, could you discuss a little bit more about the vulnerabilities of cloud computing?
Well, let's see. To a computer scientist, cloud computing is nothing new. The big change happened when we went from single computers, they started off as mainframes, now they're laptops, to distributed computing where two computers talked. And so today, cloud computing is just some servers. They were out there. It's just a new word, but it's a new marketing service more than anything technically new. Now, for cybersecurity specifically, it actually is not intrinsically helpful, but it can be helpful, because what you do is, instead of just having your perimeter right there in the software you run on your computer, if your computer basically doesn't do much except talk to your applications that are running in the cloud, that cloud can have security administrators who are really very good and are doing cyber protection for all the clients of the cloud, and can do a better job than you and I can do, because we do an update and we configure some things wrong. And so it's possible that your security could be better if you're doing the minimal things on your computer and most of the software is actually running out of the cloud. And the administrators of the cloud are attending to your security. So it could help, but it's nothing more than distributed computing. So technically it's not so much different. Chris?
Dr. Jones, yeah, I had a question. So I was exchanging email today with John Savage, who you probably know pretty well. We were talking about we still get more out of cyberspace and the internet than the risk.
That's the risk.
Right, the risk, the benefit seems to still outweigh the risk.
Yes. People use it.
Yeah.
You're part of it.
So I hang out a lot with economists, and two parts really. One, do you think there's been a failure in the computational market in some way? And do you think that eventually there'll be the kind of business drivers for this change? Do you think this is something that will basically happen without policy intervention? Or do you think policy intervention is a must here?
Well, let's see. There's a fundamental market problem, and that is that the customers won't pay for security. Will you pay $100 more for the software you're running on your laptop? On your iPhone?
Sure.
Most people say no.
Right.
I mean, $100 is not a lot of money. And so the vendors don't build it in. I mean, they build in some, but less than they probably could. And so, yes, I believe there's a market failure, but it is the perception of the customers. You could ask if there was some huge problem that came up where people reorient their risk profile. And maybe the answer is yeah, I don't know. I do think because of this there needs to be some policy intervention. I do not think this is a problem that policy is going to solve. One reason I had 3 or 4 slides that said the computer scientists among us need to develop the tools so that they can be wielded better. And I gave you the internet voting in the beginning because that was a combination of, I was using electronics and software, or they were using, to solve the verified voting solution, but it was also a policy. You know, how the election boards, they say that, yes, you've got to use something that allows, the policy is the system that you use has to have some verification mechanism, and it needs to result in paper or something else that you can count so that you can check the electronics. So I think it's a mixture of both, but it is not, let's see, I showed you those comments by government officials. I mean, having the president say, we will respond with conventional force if we perceive ourselves to be attacked, scares the bejeebers out of me. I mean, first of all, he's not going to be able to get 100% attribution. And second of all, well, it's just got a lot of problems. So I think it's a mixture of the two, but policy alone will not solve this.
Bob brings out economics.
Yes?
How about changing the liability structure? That has worked pretty well, and
That works in some cases.
it works with vaccines and a lot of things.
Well, it works for credit card companies. You're not liable for more than $50 of charges. And so The liability is, the credit card companies are very savvy about cybersecurity. Have you ever gotten a call that said, we just noticed that you used your credit card and only bought 10 cents worth of gas. Did you really need to do that? Are you buying that Lamborghini in India? Do you really want us to process that? Because they're liable. And so I think liability can change some things. I think that can be a blunt instrument. And one reason why our economy is as strong as it is because of information technology and the companies that have been in and around it. So if you did something blunt like, well, if you built the software, you're responsible for anything bad that happens, that would seize a piece of the economy of this country. And so I don't know what the right answer is. It certainly has worked in some other arenas. Gentleman in the blue shirt. Yes, sir.
There's an article in the current issue of Business Week that talks about the education of computer security people. And it says essentially that it doesn't matter how much money you throw at these kids, they don't want to go into computer security. They've got starting salaries of $150,000, full tuition, plus living expenses, and they still are not even approaching filling up the classes. Can you see anything that would turn that around, that would make people a little more interested in the subject?
Well, there certainly are a lot of people doing this. It is a very good job. The remuneration is great once you're pretty good at this. Let's see, the marketplace rules in something like that, you can certainly always buy people, you know?
Well, the problem was you couldn't buy them because they would, run off and go out in their own biz. Nobody's responding to the scholarships. I mean, it seems like, a full ticket to Carnegie Mellon plus $500 a month would certainly have attracted me when I was at that period of my career.
I went to Carnegie Mellon. I would have liked to have that. Let's see. Do you need the top 1% of the intellectual talent of the country to do this kind of work? The answer is no. And so let's see, I haven't seen that article, but money talks in the marketplace, and there are kids who want to go to school, and if I were about to go to college, I would be very fearful about student loans, and so this would look pretty good.
My question, I'm from the University of Houston, I'm a professor over there, so I'm kind of...
My father used to be a petroleum engineering professor over there, so I'm glad to see you.
Well, I'm part engineer and part information security. I've got 2 doctorates, 1 in each. And in engineering, safety reigns, period. I mean, there's a history back to the Romans where you had to stand under the bridge you built. And if it didn't work with the troops, you didn't build bad bridges again. Nowadays, I look at the computer science curriculum, I don't see security in it. It's not in the standards. If you test somebody on ABAT, it's in it only in places where you have the Dan Wallachs and you have the few professors. But from a standardized thing across the country, I would argue the vast majority of our people getting degrees in computer science or computer science-like subjects aren't getting exposed to this.
See, I would expect that most curricula would have it. I used to teach a cybersecurity course only on that subject, so I know we have it in Virginia.
Is it required of all comp sci majors?
Let's see, that was not.
Look at the head shaking.
No, it's not. You could make that a required course, I suppose. Some of it is also embedded in things. It's natural to talk about when you talk about algorithms, because you're talking about cryptography, for example. It's natural to talk about when you're talking about data structures. And so I would expect there's some of it, but no, it's certainly not a required course at Virginia, and so I'm not surprised it's not elsewhere, because it's normally taught at a junior or senior level. Because in order to do the course, you have to already have taken networks. I mean, you can't teach cybersecurity unless they've already know something about networks. They have to know something about operating systems, and of course they have to program. You have to be able to read and write programs. And so you're already up in the junior and senior year, and usually none of those are required courses. You can take compilers or database systems or cybersecurity, and you choose.
But I would
Maybe that's a flaw in our curriculum.
I would argue, though, that where you first learn to program is where the problem starts. Because when I first learned engineering, it was driven into our heads. You made a mistake on a problem and the loads were wrong, then you didn't just get off 5 points for the exam if your plane crashed, because I was a rocket scientist. If the vessel failed, you failed the exam.
We don't do that in computer science. Now, a lot of these issues are poor software practices and not classically what computer scientists would say is cybersecurity. The lack of security, vulnerabilities come from the poor software practices. That is required. Everybody gets a CS degree is going to take software engineering in some ilk and maybe even a couple of courses in it. And I think you're absolutely right. That's where the safety starts. Would the world change if we had some terrible incident? Mm-hmm. And would the perception of safety first become accepted for the cyber world? I don't know. Richard?
I've been thinking. So, I grew up racing cars. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm going to give you an axiom that I learned if you go here. The technology for going fast always outpaces the technology for being safe. Okay, even when its lives are at even when lives are at stake, it just goes faster. To the point that in racing, the sanctioning organizations had to come in and change the game, because even people dealing with their own lives would say, "We're going to go fast, and we're not going to worry about being safe." And that happens in all the sports. Okay?
So they changed the standards?
They change the standard, they change the rules. You can't do that. In drag racing, instead of a quarter mile, now it's 1,000 feet. So because people, even their own lives, they just say, we're going to go fast, not being so safe. That's what we see here.
And so maybe the counterpart is liability.
This is fun, but I think there's an externality here. Like Microsoft Word gets upgraded about every 3 weeks. They get a new upgrade, and they're changing things just to change things. If you start upgrading that fast, it's very hard to keep quality control because and sometimes it'll fail because of something they did.
Right.
So, and that's because of some competitive pressures that probably doing all this. They're trying to keep out competitors. So maybe this thing basically flawed with an information system where you're protecting it by making it complex.
They are responding to their market.
Are they, or are they responding to protecting their product from competitors?
That's the market.
Same thing.
No, it's not.
No, I think they're adding new functions because that gives them a new bell and whistle, and so they can sell that for some added money.
Let's take one more question.
Okay, so this question is steering the conversation a little bit away from the topic at hand, but I don't really have much knowledge about computer science, but I am interested in like health sciences and healthcare policy, and one issue I think is electronic medical records, and I think a big important issue is increasing patient accessibility to those records, and I know there's drawbacks in that and like security breaches and issues like that. I don't know if you ever dealt with that in your career, but if you had an opinion on that, or like can discuss like the implications of potential like security breaches in that realm.
Well, let's see, it is, the healthcare records are essentially an echo of many other cybersecurity kind of problems. I have a quite, it's biased, it may be wrong, but it's my view, and that is that the medical profession has kept tight control over anything being done that related to medical records. And if what you did is actually brought in a bunch of data experts, okay, not health experts, but people who understand how to structure records and do the security, we would have long ago had much better health records, including with more security. And so I think the problem is the right technical people have not been essentially allowed to work on that problem.
Please stay for our reception, and please thank Dr. Anita Jones.